welcome. In this particular video we are looking at adding and subtracting integers. So the idea and the manner in which we want to look at adding and subtracting integers is in such a way that you already have an exposure to multiplying and dividing, or rather multiplying integers, right? So remember, integers are just negative and positive numbers, that have the negative counterparts of the positive whole numbers as well. Okay, so let me start off with an example. If you were given 2 plus 3, you would tell me the answer is 5, right? And we want to say that if something does not have a sign in front of it, that is just going to automatically be a positive. So if 2 is the same as positive 2. Now let us look carefully at this example. Plus 2 plus 3 is positive 5. You can already notice something from here, right? This is the same as saying plus 2, and let me add another number. It's going to be plus 2 plus 3. Plus 2 plus 3. And the answer is just going to be 5, right? Positive 5. Now, one of the things that I'm getting at here is when I add integers of the same number, of the same sign, I'm adding two integers which have exactly the same sign. All I need to do is I need to keep the sign and give me the sum of those two integers, or those two numbers. Okay, so let's look at another example. Let's say I've got positive 4 plus positive 11. Again, same signs, I'm just adding them. I can just take the sum of that two. It's going to be positive 15. And that's exactly the exact same thing you got when you were in primary school. Now, if we were to look at another way of looking at this, is I'm going to say, well, okay, plus 2 plus 3 is exactly the same as saying plus 2 plus positive 3, and that gives me positive 5, right? I can either separate this notation, or I can get a notation like something like this in between. And how we're going to do this is we're going to say, well, okay, if I give you plus 2 plus positive 4, this really means I'm saying an invisible 1 multiplied by this bracket over here. And that's what we're doing. So in order to simplify this, I need to multiply out the signs first. I say that is going to be positive, and then I multiply the 1 multiplied by the 4. That gives me positive 4. And now I say that's plus 2 plus 4 is equal to plus 6. Okay, what about adding integers of the same sign but both of them are negative? For example, negative 6 plus negative 8. Well, I'm going to show you a manner in which we simplify this. Okay, so how can I simplify this? Well, I'm going to write down just negative 6, and then I'm going to multiply this out. Now remember, in front of the bracket I said there's an invisible 1 over here that indicates that this is positive 1 multiplied by negative 8. So that's going to be positive multiplied by a negative, and that gives me negative, and then 1 multiplied by 8 gives me negative 8. Now when I have exactly the same signs and I have to add these integers, if the signs are identical, all I need to do is I need to take the sum of 6 and 8 is 14, and I keep the negative. Remember, I'm not multiplying over here, I'm simply adding. Let's look at another example. Minus 11 plus minus 12. Okay, let's simplify that. This is the same as saying that's negative 11, and this here has got an invisible 1, and I say positive times negative is a negative, and a 1 times 12 is just negative 12. I'm adding two negative numbers. When I add the two negative numbers, the result is still negative, and I just take the sum. The sum of these two is going to be 23, and it remains negative. Okay, so let's see if things get a bit more interesting. Let's talk about integers where we add them, but the numbers themselves are different. The numbers themselves, or rather the signs, are different. What about positive 14, right, plus negative 8? Well, let's simplify that. That's simply going to be positive 14. Then the negative over here, I'm going to say that's again that invisible 1. And a positive times a negative gives me a negative, something you've seen in the previous video, and 1 multiplied by 8 is just 8, right? 14, now we get positive 14 minus 8. It's exactly the same as saying 14 minus 8 because this is positive. Okay, and what is 14 minus 8? The answer is 6. Now, here's a key rule that we will learn when you see that two numbers have different signs and you've got to put them together. You've got to add them. Remember, we're not multiplying, we are simply adding. All I do is I keep the sign of the bigger number. Okay, so when I add things where the signs are different, adding two different, I'm going to make a note. If I'm adding differently signed numbers or integers, differently signed numbers, adding differently signed numbers, number one is I find the difference. Now what do I mean by the difference? I mean I need to determine what is the difference between 14 and 8. The answer is 6. Number two, I use the sign of the bigger number. And when I say bigger number, I mean the biggest absolute value. I mean, if you're only looking at 14 and 8, you're not looking at whether the number is negative or positive. Okay, so let's do another two examples. What about negative 22 plus 16 plus positive 16? Well, I need to simplify that first. When I simplify it, I get the following. I say that is just simply negative 22, a positive multiplied by a positive, that's going to be positive, and this invisible 1 multiplied by the 16, that's going to give me positive 16. Now the signs are different. When the signs are different and I have to add two differently signed numbers, all I do is I say what's the difference between 22 and 16, and the answer is going to be 6, and I keep the sign of the bigger number, for example negative 6. Okay, let's take a few for you to do. Minus 11 plus positive 10 is equal to positive 18 plus positive 16 is equal to, and you should do these ones right away, okay, positive 92 plus negative 32, okay, and then let's do one more, minus 18 plus minus 12. Okay, so you do them quickly, press pause and then play the video to check your solutions. Okay, quite simply, remember when we multiply this out we get minus 11, and I say positive times a positive remains positive, and the invisible 1 multiplied by 10, that gives me just 10. Now the signs are different. All I need to do is find the difference. The difference between 10 and 11 is just 1, and I use the sign of the bigger number, which is minus 1. Over here I will get the following. I get 18 and 16, so I simplify this. That's just positive 18. Positive times a positive is just positive, and invisible 1 multiplied by 16 is just 16. Now what does this give me? This is going to give me the following. Well, that gives me 34, right? And I keep the sign, it remains positive. In this case over here I've got positive 92, multiply these signs and I get a negative, and then I've got an invisible 1 multiplied by 32, and that simply gives me positive 92 minus 32, or 92 minus 32, and the answer is going to be 60 when I find the difference, and I keep the sign of the bigger number, so it's positive 60. And then finally the last one over here, I've got minus 18, multiply this and I get negative 12. Again the signs are the same, so I just add them together, and that's going to give me 30, and I keep the sign of the bigger number. I keep the sign the same, so that's just negative 30. Okay, so that's how you add and subtract negative numbers.